I consume a lot of mods, texture packs, and tweaks in any of the games or emulators that I play, but what I'm not is very smart, so the thought of creating anything that I consume is extremely daunting to me. So I came up with the idea to try my hand at remastering a game from my childhood all by myself. And I don't mean taking someone else's work, I mean literally by myself, all by hand, trying to remaster a game. And to make it even more stressful than it already is, I'm gonna give myself exactly 10 days to do it. So join me on this journey as I try to remaster a game from my childhood all by myself. But first, a word from our sponsor. We all love video games, but what's better than games is games at a fraction of the price, and that's exactly what you can do here on Instant Gaming. By far the best thing about Instant Gaming is that it's not your usual marketplace key site. All of the keys here are sourced directly by Instant Gaming themselves, therefore you never have to worry about getting a dodgy key, and also the keys are just delivered incredibly fast. But I know this from personal experience. I've been on this platform buying games since 2018 and I have not had a single issue. So if you're interested, use my affiliate link in the description to save yourself some money on great games whilst also supporting the channel. Let's get back to the video. To make this easier on me as a beginner, I tried to pick a game that was extremely moddable and easier to tinker. So on day one, I basically made a list of all the games that I would consider remastering. And I very quickly decided that I wanted this to be from the PS2 era of games. Not only is this the era that I grew up in, but also these games are kind of somewhere in the middle. They're not the PS1 where they're really blocky and hard to remaster, but they're not the Xbox 360 PS3 games where some of them actually look quite good even to this day. PS2 therefore is in that sweet spot where everything is kind of just not to modern standards, and I think upscaling it is going to give the biggest difference. I eliminated a few games from this list instantly that just weren't fitting the bill. For example, games with cartoony art styles such as Ultimate Spider-Man aren't really exactly the perfect candidate for remastering, as this art style ages extremely well, and because it ages quite well, it's not going to be that drastic if I remaster it. So I got it down to 5 games, and then I just ran a poll on my channel in order for you guys to decide which game I was going to ultimately remaster, and overwhelmingly the poll went to God of War. Out of all these games, it's actually the one that I played the most, so it was kind of a stroke of luck that this one got chosen. I was hoping at this point that the experience with the game might help me a little bit in remastering it. Also, it does help that this game was so ahead of its time in terms of visuals, so I kind of had a little bit of a head start here. So I started by figuring out what I was actually working with here, and my assumptions were correct. This game has held up extremely well. And the moment that I booted it up, I was already using the default 4K settings that I usually use, so basically right away this game was looking amazing. This obviously isn't how we remember it, so I set everything back to default to see how it actually looked back then. This is why I love emulation, it's just so accessible. Like the fact that I can do a single click and get this game running in 4K is basically a free remaster in of itself. I began first doing the simple things like tweaking the settings, so the 4K internal resolution for example, as well as anisotropic filtering set to 16 times. I also played around with the adaptive sharpening option within PCSX2, and I actually quite liked it. I set it to 60% and it did give the game that much needed bump in sharpening. Also, this effect doesn't over sharpen the image even at 100%, which was really nice. Besides that, the obvious thing that stuck out like a sore thumb now at 4K was the textures. We're dealing with 512 by 512 resolution textures here. And to put that into perspective, nowadays in modern games, we're dealing with textures 4 times the size of that. I think nowadays most games have 2K textures and reserve the 4K textures for a high resolution texture pack. Those high resolution texture packs alone sometimes run at about 80 gigabytes. And they don't really make that much of a difference as 2K still looks really good. So what I'm going to do for this texture pack is remake some of them in 2K if I feel that it's needed, but also 1K is just fine. So I'm going to just mix match both of them. I went ahead and picked out a few spots in the game that I wanted to see remastered. I want to see the title screen specifically looking really high res, and I'd love to be able to upscale the font and the logo. And then I want to try the very first section of the game on the boat. I want all of the planks on the floor and the rope all to look high res as they're looking really blurry here. And I really didn't know how hard or difficult this was going to be, so at first I was just going to prioritize the little things in the scene that stuck out in order to not waste my time. I thought that starting small like this was a really good idea, so I stuck with that. I then found this scene with these 2 statues that I really wanted to upscale. And then lastly, if I had the time, I really wanted to upscale the Olympus throne room. The skulls, pillars, walls, carpet, all of it's just a tiny little bit blurry, and I think this would look incredible upscaled. Now I've been using Photoshop for over 10 years now, and I was also a professional graphic designer at one point. So I'm hoping, since I have a little bit of Photoshop knowledge, it would carry me through the challenge. I did some light research on texturing and PCSX2 textures and all that, and I realized that I was way out of my depth here. Like, for example, I would say I tend to play around with mods and files and settings a lot more than the average gamer. But when it comes to actually making this stuff, I mean, I have no clue. So I capped off this day feeling pretty worried about the road ahead. So I started figuring out how to actually dump the textures of the game, and surprisingly, there's a lot of information online. I went down the rabbit hole here, and basically there's a guy called Sad Origami, which, if you've watched his channel before, I showed a spreadsheet with loads of different texture packs, and that spreadsheet is made by him. He's at the moment remastering Shadow of the Colossus, and he's doing a really great job at it. And on his links page, I saw a Discord. Now I'm not sure if he owns this Discord, but it's basically a server dedicated to retro texture packs. And once I had gone in there, there was a resource channel with a texture pack modding guide, an 8-page long guide on everything about texture packs and modding them into the PCSX2 emulator. It felt like I honestly had hit the jackpot, but then my high was quickly crushed when I read the very first sentence of the guide that said that the PCSX2 emulator is one of the most challenging ones out there to make texture packs for. Hopefully they're just saying it was challenging and then figured it all out and they're going to tell me all the secrets, so I carried on. So what I found was the way texture dumping works in PCSX2 is it essentially just dumps the textures that are being loaded in as you're playing. This means if you want to remaster the entirety of a game, you have to play it all the way through. With this in mind, I stood in the boat scene of the game and started to dump the textures. To do this, you just go Settings, Graphics, Texture Replacements, and then click Dump Textures. In here is a bunch of game codes, and I just had to find the one that was correspondent to my copy of God of War. And in that folder was every single texture from this boat scene, so I put them into Photoshop to see exactly what I was working with here. And they were almost completely transparent when I opened them. I could obviously just duplicate the layer over and over again to bring back the opacity, but I referred to the guide to see if there was anything there. And they said this kind of behavior was normal with PS2 textures to run at about 50% opacity. And it also pointed towards a tool that you can use called Alpha Channel Remover. You can input all of the textures into this tool, it will tell you what opacity all of them are running at, and then it will also convert them to 100% opacity so that you can edit them. It's important that after you edit them, you turn them back to whatever opacity the program told you. For God of War textures, all of the ones that I imported were at 50%. And with now a fully opaque texture, what I did was just upscale it to 4 times using Photoshop scaling methods. And this just kind of looked like I had smeared Vaseline all over the texture, so this was not the ideal approach. A lot of resources point towards using an upscaler called ESRGAN. But what I noticed was that this program is very similar to something that I use for my YouTube thumbnails. Whenever I want to upscale something that's really blurry online, I use Gigapixel. And from my experience using it, I've put in some pretty bad low-res images and got really good results out of it. So I thought that maybe using this for my textures was going to save me a lot of time. So I tried it on the rope texture, and yeah, this looks nothing like rope. The standard model makes it look kind of like dried grass, and then the art and CG model makes it look kind of like a wood carving, and then low resolution is kind of like an abstract piece of art. The upscaling was just not really understanding what it was in the first place. So as a last resort, I tried out Gigapixel's new V2 recovery model, and this by far gave me the best results. It still doesn't really look like rope, but maybe if we put it in game, it will look a lot better. So I exported it as a PNG and put it side by side to the original. There's a certain look that these upscaling models give images, and it's really hard to explain. Like, I think the technology is pretty amazing nowadays, but there's just something not quite right about it. Anyway, I went back to the textures folder of the game, and there's a folder in there called replacements. Basically, everything you put inside here is going to tell the PCSX2 emulator to load that texture. So I went back to PCSX2 and ticked the box load textures, and we just remastered the first texture of the video. This is a pretty big milestone, even though we just slapped it into an upscaler. But as you can see, it looks pretty weird. And that's just because I've used the version of the file that is normalized to 100% opacity. So I need to whack it back in Photoshop, set it to 50% opacity, and now it looks a lot more normal. I finished the day feeling pretty confident, and I was ready to tackle the other textures tomorrow. On day 5, an idea hit me. That rope texture is a good example of just, a common object. Unlike Kratos himself, devs have probably scanned an actual rope into the game, or at least hand-drawn one from a reference image. And I've watched a lot of game development type videos where people take pictures of stuff out in the real world, and they basically make textures out of them using Photoshop. So I thought I'd try the same thing. I didn't have any rope like that laying around in my house, but of course the internet is a thing and it has so many images of different types of rope, and I managed to find one that matched a resemblance of what I wanted. I put it into Photoshop and cut it out so there was just a singular piece of the rope, and then I scaled it correctly. I tried to get it in a way where the actual lines of the rope actually matched the original, so this meant flipping the rope and then making sure that it lined up the best that I could get it. I then tried to make the colours match, as this one was definitely way too light than the original. Once I was happy with it, I put it in game and realised that I'd gone a bit overboard here. You see, the original texture's quite flat in comparison, and when you have this much contrast and detail, things tend to stick out a bit too much. There was also little light highlights that were on the original that weren't on this one. So I tried adding those in Photoshop with just the paintbrush tool, and I'm not gonna lie, it looks nice, but it's just not the original. Like, it's so damn hard to get it looking exactly how it did, because it's just so high res now and every detail shows. I landed at this final iteration, and I'm still not 100% on it, but I knew I could not be this much of a perfectionist on every texture, otherwise I would definitely not make the deadline. One thing I did have to sort out though was the fact that this texture was not seamless. You can actually see where it stops and the new one starts. I'll admit, I completely glossed over the fact that, yeah, textures are repeated and therefore they need to be seamless. So I put them in Photoshop and tried to figure out the easiest way to do this. And basically there's a feature in Photoshop that lets you offset the entire canvas to make it repeat like the texture's going to. And then all you have to do is take the really harsh seams that you can see in the middle and make them blend perfectly. Now, what I used to do back in the day was use the spot healing brush and the stamp tool, but nowadays Photoshop has come so far that you can just highlight the seam and select generative fill. Now, I'll admit I had to go over it twice and it still wasn't perfect. This was just a case where generative fill wasn't really understanding how to seamlessly blend these two together, but once I had put it in game, it was actually really clean looking. That's where I kind of realized that what you see on Photoshop up close is obviously nothing compared to when you see it in game, as you're blowing up these textures super big, and in game they're tiny and repeated. So in future, I'd keep that in mind. It's also so quick and easy to just keep replacing the textures, and you can do it all in real time whilst in game, so it's not really that much of a problem. I capped off the work here by replacing the floor texture of the boat, and I'd noticed that they had reused the same texture here with just some green over it, which is really smart. In the game, this makes the floor look slightly corroded from the weather. Remastering this floor texture was actually really fun. I grabbed a weathered plank texture from online and then basically made it look one-to-one to the original, even to the point where the plank stops and starts in the same exact position. I then just added a solid color of green over everything, then used the blend if option inside the blending options to make it nicely blend together with the wood grain. I then inverted the layer mask and painted back the bits that I wanted it to show so that all of the planks weren't green. Now I think in this case my version was a lot better than what the upscaling did. Upscaling obviously kept every single little detail from the original, but the extra work that I put in detailing all of the corrosion on the planks made my texture stick out as really realistic, whereas the AI was just upscaling, a wood texture with a green blob on it. Looking at them side by side though, it was clear that my green wasn't quite right, so I changed that in Photoshop to make sure it matched. Now here I had to make a pretty big decision going forward, one that could either make or break this video. The upscale textures look tremendously close to the original, closer than I could ever get with my skills. It's like as faithful as it can get in terms of line work, but also something's just not quite right with it when you look up close. But then the textures that I could produce are really high res and super detailed, but the issue is they weren't really so much as a remaster as they were almost a remake. And when you put it like that, you can see why upscaling is favoured a lot nowadays when it comes to making fan-made texture packs. You just cannot make a faithful remaster of a game's textures without having the know-how and skills to pull it off. So I decided from this point on that I was going to cut corners when necessary in order to make the deadline that I set for myself. And hopefully with this plan going forward, I can make everything look cohesive. And so I logged off for the day and continued the journey the very next day. I need to get this boat scene done as quickly as possible, so I went through and did all of the textures here. Some of them by hand, some of them upscaling. I started to really pick up the pace here of texturing this boat scene. I did, however, keep making the same mistake over and over again of exporting everything at 100% opacity. Also, there was a second rope texture that I tried to remake using an image that I found online, but it just looked really bad. I gave it the benefit of the doubt and just put it into the game, and it did look better than it did in Photoshop, but I'm definitely going to have to come back and change this one later. There was some sort of chain that I couldn't really spot inside the scene, but I remade it anyway. I, however, did actually prefer the upscaling version of it, so I went with that. Now, the big textures that I really wanted to take care of were Kratos' weapons. I actually found a high-res version of the weapons online that I was going to replace with this old one. However, there were really noticeable differences in the blade. I'm not sure if I just got the wrong blade here, but I was willing to actually try to make it look like the original. And after about 40 minutes, I was actually pretty happy with the results. It's not perfect by any means, and some of the lines are extremely warped, but I'm pretty proud of it. However, putting it in game got rid of the chains for some reason. It also just looked a little bit too dark and way too metallic. So I upscaled it, and I'd like the upscaling version more. This is yet another case where I have literally spent almost an hour remaking this texture, and then I upscale it in the matter of 5 seconds, and I prefer it. I just think the weapon just gets that added little bit of fidelity to it, rather than, you know, looking completely different like my version does. One thing that you can easily replace without it looking bad though is the environment textures like we've explored. So I did the same for this rock texture that's in the background of the cliffs. There are a lot of miscellaneous textures here as well, like rain splash effects that I all just upscaled using Gigapixel. Another one that I recreated from scratch was this one that I thought looked like a wooden crate. So I started re-texturing it as a wooden crate. But I would later find out that this is not what this texture is used for. After that, I had fully remastered the boat scene. Of course, the only thing missing was Kratos himself. I was worried about remastering Kratos, so I left it last. But honestly, Gigapixel did such an amazing job here that I did not have to do anything. For the texture that was featuring his face, I tried to use the face recovery tool a little bit within Gigapixel in order to not lose the detail around his beard and his scar on his left eye. I absolutely love the little details that got added to his lower chest after this upscaling. I really tried to hand make stuff, like I put it in Photoshop and I really meticulously went through this Kratos texture and just tried to pick out anything that maybe I could do, and then I put it in Gigapixel, saw the results, and I just realized that whatever I was going to come up with here was not going to be as good as this. So I just went with Gigapixel here and saved myself the time and moved on to the next scene. So in this scene, I want these two statues to be really high res. And I noticed in the background that this crate texture, or what I thought was a crate texture, is actually a piece of the wall. It didn't look too bad, but it was also extremely jarring going from that really high res texture to the super low res one right underneath it. For now though, I focused on the statue and the floor piece, running them through Gigapixel. This required quite a bit of tinkering with the settings. The face recovery tool didn't work here because it wasn't detecting the statue's face, so this actually took quite a lot of tinkering to get right, but I think I got it pretty good. So back on the topic of this wall behind the statues, I actually decided to leave the crate texture, but I just wanted to upscale the texture underneath it. So I grabbed the same piece of wood that I used for the crate texture and just stretched it out so it matched the whole wall. I then adjusted the colours because the colours were a lot lighter on this wall compared to the top part. The results were nice, but like, I don't think this is exactly what the original was supposed to look like. At this point, I really worried that I was going in the wrong direction for the game. Maybe I was misinterpreting these textures a lot and it just was not faithful at all. I left it for now, but I knew that I had to come back to these textures at one point. So title screen. This was incredibly quick, easy, and also really fun. For the text, it was just a file with all of the different letters laid out, and I grabbed the exact font that they used from online and just replaced everything one by one. This worked amazingly well, and also for the logo, I found a really high res one online that I replaced it for. This one didn't have a stroke or a drop shadow like the original one does, so I added that. I also added my own little flair to the logo as well. Since this was so incredibly fast and easy, at the end of day 8, I swung back around to the textures on the wall that I was going to look at, and I run the lower wall texture through Gigapixel to see what that would look like. Now this is way better, I think. It really gives off the vibe that it's plywood, and I think that's what they were going for. But of course that top section now looks extremely out of place, so I need to upscale that maybe, and then it would look coherent. And yeah, I think this is way better than what I did, so I kept it like this. I was basically going at breakneck speed at this point. I'd got the hang of everything, dumping the textures, replacing them, Photoshop, Gigapixel, all of it was just coming naturally, and I was doing it so incredibly fast than I ever thought I was going to be able to. I was going so fast, in fact, that on this day, I basically upscaled some other textures that I didn't intend to for this video, just out of pure fun and curiosity. Like the boxes that you open in the game, for example, that restore Kratos' health and his ability power. And now they just look incredibly sharp and more modern looking without any artifacts at all. And the final scene that I wanted to work on, the Olympus one, I wanted to try mass upscaling everything here in one swoop to see how fast I can really do it. So I set everything to upscale to a 2K resolution and set the model to recover. And in a minute or so, this scene now looks incredible. I had at this point basically figured out how to remaster and upscale textures incredibly quick and easy. Now, texturing was not actually the only thing that I wanted to do for this video. I wanted to also add ambient occlusion as well as ray trace global illumination via ReShade. But this was where I faced my biggest hurdle yet. You see, PCSX2 doesn't really play nice with ReShade. Firstly, I installed it targeting the Vulkan API, but that just crashed my game completely. I tried multiple different fixes to get this working, but just ended up having to resort to OpenGL. What was weird though is I've got this to work with Vulkan flawlessly before, so I don't know why it's not working now. Also, although OpenGL worked, I couldn't get it to work in full screen. In order to use full screen, I have to load the game itself in full screen from the get-go. I can't load it in windowed and then double click to full screen. That just gets rid of ReShade. An annoying workaround, but nothing compared to the hurdle that I had to face next, the depth buffer. As far as I know, PCSX2 has never played nice with ReShade's depth buffer. Without this, we actually can't add ambient occlusion or ray tracing. In simple terms, it basically tells ReShade how close and far objects are away, and it uses that data to add the ambient occlusion to the scene. It sucks because in modern games we use ray tracing where we simulate how light bounces like it does in the real world. But in a game this old like God of War, that obviously doesn't exist. And there's no ambient occlusion either. Ambient occlusion basically fakes this effect by giving everything slight shadows. And whilst it doesn't look amazing and some people probably don't like it, I think it really adds to older games. And then obviously ray trace global illumination is an obvious one, where things that are a 2D texture can now become a light source. So I spent hours, quite literally hours, trying to get this to work with no result whatsoever. And at one point there was a glimmer of hope because I got the normals working, but the depth side of it just was never really how it should look. So naturally feeling pretty defeated, I went for a walk in order to come back with a fresh mind in order to try to remaster it in other ways. So in ReShade, changing the levels and the contrast brightness and all the other tweaks, I just don't really think they're necessary. All that I did was add the ambient light effect alongside bloom. Now I made these really subtle, and I think they just ever so slightly lift the image. I'm someone that hates overdoing reshade effects. I think less is more when it comes to this stuff. But overall, end of day 9 was pretty sad because I just didn't get to do the lighting or the ambient occlusion. Maybe if we do a video similar like this, we can pick a game that actually uses this so I can tinker around with it. And so we reach the final day. I basically spent this day just going over everything that I had done and just making sure that I was happy with it. And after a bit of tinkering here and there, I thought that it was time to finally show you my version of a remaster of God of War. Is it perfect? No. But the fact that I did it myself made it all that much more rewarding. I think what I learned from making this video was just how easy it all is nowadays, and the fact that any of you watching this video can remaster your childhood games for yourself, and they're gonna look a whole lot better than what we used to be able to achieve. I had brought one of my favourite childhood games into the modern era with a little bit of Photoshop, online tutorials, and an upscaling tool. Now I want to thank my Patreons for supporting the channel. YouTube monetization is wildly unreliable nowadays, and so Patreon is by far the best way to support what I make here on Retro Renew. And if you're interested in joining, you can do so for just £1 a month by following the link in the description. Also, if you're new here and enjoyed the video, consider subscribing for more renewing of older games. This was a lot of fun to make, so I'm thinking of doing something very similar, or maybe even making a guide out of what I've learned here. If you want to see more about texture packs for emulators, then I recommend you watch this video where I explore them and also show you how to get them yourself. See you over there.